suddenly I see this gray-white mass dashing from the left in front of the car. I tried to swerve, but I hit this deer, full-grown deer, and it was looking at me as the impact took place.
So at what point do fear and concern and suspicion about disease themselves become a form of disease, become pathological, become hypochondria? Turns out that that's a really difficult question to answer.
Ugly things and beautiful things and absurd things and incomprehensible things and tragic things.
Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of the Coach House podcast, celebrating our 60th anniversary in 2025. Good on paper since 1965. I'm James Lindsay. On this show, we have the return of our most popular feature, Poets Corner, where Coach House poets pick their favorite poems from other Coach House poets. We also have an amazing conversation with Will Rees, whose new book, Hypochondria, was recently published. So stick around. Welcome to Poets Corner, where Coach House poets read poems from other Coach House poets. This week, we have Stuart Ross reading The Animals in the Room by Meghan Kemp-Gee from her collection, The Animal in the Room. Hello, Stuart. Welcome to the Coach House podcast.
Hey there, James.
Stuart, who are you?
Oh, gosh. I wasn't prepared for that question. I'm a writer, a poet, fiction writer, personal essay, ranter, memoirist, living in Cobourg, Ontario, after half a century in Toronto. I'm the author of about 20-something books, and most recently, a little dream came true for me, which is that one of those books was published by some place called Coach House Books, and it's a book of poetry called The Sky is a Sky in the Sky, and I'm so pleased that it exists.
Or as we lovingly call it in the office, Sky, Sky, Sky.
Okay.
Stuart, welcome to Poets Corner. This is where we get Coach House poets to read other Coach House poets. So I was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about the poem and the poet you chose, and then I'll ask you to read it.
Yeah, I chose a poem by Meghan Kemp-Gee from her amazing book, The Animal in the Room. And it's in fact almost the title poem, because it's not called The Animal in the Room, it's called The Animals in the Room. And it's a poem, like so many in that collection, that really, really fascinates me.
Okay, well, we'll talk about it afterwards. But why would you do us the honor of doing a reading of it for us?
Sure. The Animals in the Room. You drank too much. The animals came into the room. They saw your path to the exit blocked. Their herd sense calculated one or two escapes, attuned tick-bitten ears on your behalf to the exact moment when you could have spoken up, turned an art appraiser's eye to silence, threw themselves into the painting on the wall, the deer with hard black eyes, and one bright painful spot of blue in them. They came into the room. Your terror wanted them to watch what happened, and your terror saw the blue spot, and your terror got a lichen-eating audience to your bullseye focus on that blue-stained motel deer's eye. Your terror drank too much. Your eyes summoned them. They saw your story shrink into a fist.
Beautiful. Thank you, Stuart. I love this poem. This is so great.
Yeah.
Can you start off just by telling why you selected this poem?
Well, I have some very personal reasons why I selected this poem. There's so many poems I could have chosen. I really like the sort of hallucinatory ambiance created. The way that this mind fucks with the reader's, this poem fucks with the reader's mind is so fascinating to me, and it's such a great projection onto the reader of the you in the poem. Also, I hit a deer on the highway on February 2nd, 2024, and so this really spoke to me, and I'll talk about that more.
Wait, I want to go into that now. For people who haven't read this book, The Animal in the Room, there are a lot of deer. There's a wolf. There's a lot of animals in general in it that sort of personify different humans or different qualities. So maybe we can go into this right now about your deer. That's not a deer anymore, I'm guessing.
No, I assume it's the meal of a lot of very lucky animals that were also in the forest alongside the secondary highway. So, I was on my way back from Ottawa, a rainy, dark night on February 2nd, 2024. Very, very narrow highway with forest on both sides. And suddenly I see this gray-white mass dashing from the left in front of the car. I tried to swerve, but I hit this deer, full-grown deer, and it was looking at me as the impact took place. And it's still one of the most stunning moments for me. It makes it very, very hard to drive even now. I'm so scared of deers jumping into the way. So this poem, which has so much terror and so much revenge possibly, or anger, really, really struck me.
I'm really sorry that happened. I'm glad you're okay. I feel bad for the deer, but I'm also glad you're okay.
Yeah, it wasn't until the next day I realized how lucky I was. I mean, there are people who get killed because they hit a deer or a moose or something on a highway. I was fine. My car was a wreck. And in fact, it took 5 months for my car to be fixed. They ordered all these parts, and those took like a couple of months to arrive. And meanwhile, my car was parked out on the street by my place, undrivable. And so once they replaced all the parts, the car wouldn't start. It was because rodents had gotten in and eaten all of the wiring in my car. And I saw this as the rodents avenging the deer. It's like, fuck you, you killed a deer, you get to drive on. No. I drove with guilt anyways. Driving's a bad thing. And now I drive with extra guilt.
Do you want to talk about some of this like revenge and anger that you see in this poem?
Well, because the poem is in the second person, there is this almost accusatory tone to it to start with. It's very subtle, but it's there. The repetition of your terror, your terror, your terror 3 times after the halfway point in the sonnet is so striking to me. I love the way the poem starts. It starts with 2 very simple declarative sentences. You drank too much, the animals came into the room. Then the next line begins with another similar but slightly more complex sentence. They saw your path to the exit blocked. And after that, there is this onslaught of sort of drunken, hallucinatory kind of imagery hitting me. I find the poem incredibly ambiguous, which I really love in a poem. Every time I read it, I find different things, or I change my mind about different lines. And then I love the simplicity of that last line. They saw your story shrink into a fist. And that to me is, I can't even completely explain for myself what that last line means, but it is terrifying.
It's menacing, isn't it? Like the fist.
Yeah, it's menacing. What a way to leave that addressed reader, or the you of the poem.
Yeah. I also think about that first sentence, the you drank too much, which is accusatory, right? Like in this sense, it also sort of prepares us for the animals about to come into the room and all this other stuff that's going to happen. But that feels accusatory, like right off the bat is like, you drank too much, almost in a guilty way.
Yeah, I would like to clarify, I didn't drink at all or smoke anything when I was driving my car down that Highway 37.
Fair.
I just want to let you know, that wasn't why I related to this poem. But the you drank too much also helps to explain what might be sort of hallucinatory and disjointed about the way this poem unfolds. I love poems that are unsettling. I love poems that are disturbing. I know people say, a lot of my students, I teach a night class in Introduction to Poetry. They say, I say, what is poetry? Poetry is a reflection of the beauty we see in the world. Poetry evokes beauty. art is about beautiful things. Art is about ugly things and beautiful things and absurd things and incomprehensible things and tragic things. And I think there's a little bit of all of that in this poem. There is a kind of dark, very dark humor I see underlying this poem as well, and in a lot of the poems in Meghan's book.
I keep going back to that spot of blue that comes back a few times. And then in that last very long sentence, when I was reading this after we talked about you picking this poem, I just can't get over that the blue stained motel deer's eye part at that point. Because I wanted to ask your opinion on that line, because especially the motel, like we have the blue, and I get the blue stain. But then we have motel here, which almost makes me want to think we are in a motel while this is happening,
Yeah, I feel like when I read it the first time, I was in a motel before I saw the word motel.
Yeah.
I mean, I had that feeling, somebody on the road.
Yeah.
And I do find that blue-stained motel deer's eye one of the most confounding phrases in this poem. And I can't wrap my mind around it.
Yes.
I can't articulate what it could possibly suggest. It suggests something very sort of abstract and instinctive to me, but I couldn't even define it. So I see this deer's eye as a blue stain. I see this motel room with old wallpaper whose walls are moldy and stained in some way. It just creates such an incredible moment for me. Other readers will probably get very different things. And I talked about the deer that I killed because I think it's important that every person obviously brings their own life experience, their background, their everything to a poem. And so a poem is going to be a different poem. This poem isn't, one poem. I don't know how many copies it sold. Let's hopefully say it sold 627 at least.
At least.
This book, at least, all right. There's 627 poems here because there's 627 people with different life experiences reading this poem. I wonder what it would be like to read this poem as someone who hadn't killed a deer.
Stuart, thank you for coming on the Coach House podcast, to Poets Corner, to talk about The Animal in the Room by Meghan Kemp-Gee.
Thanks a lot, James. It was a pleasure. Everyone should buy the book.
Founder and director of Peninsula Press, Will Rees has written for Granta and the Times Literary Supplement. He's also the author of Hypochondria, which the New York Times called a genre-bending meditation on hypochondria, referencing everyone from Freud to Kafka. He talked to me from his home in London. Hello, Will Rees. Welcome to the Coach House podcast.
Hi, James. Great to be here.
To start off, can you tell us what brought you to write Hypochondria? What was your motivation, inspiration? Why choose Hypochondria? Why call the book Hypochondria?
Sure. Well, the short answer is having been a hypochondriac myself, or rather being someone who has spent a lot of time worrying about his health, which may or may not be the same thing. That's very much one of the core questions of the book. The slightly longer answer is that when some years ago I was looking for a topic for a master's level course in psychoanalysis, I decided that I would write about this topic, which was close to my heart, or close to my mind, I should perhaps say. And writing this paper taught me that there was this rich and fascinating history to hypochondria, which it turned out is a word that's been in use for many hundreds of years, in fact for millennia. The word dates back to Hippocrates in the 5th century BC, and which for much of that time was actually considered to be a physical disease. It was a disease that was seated in the abdomen in a region called the hypochondrium, and it was a kind of subspecies of melancholy. So according to the medical wisdom of ancient Greece, it was believed that it was caused by an overactive hypochondrium, which was overproducing black bile. This caused a series of physical symptoms, gastrointestinal complaints, things like this. And in addition, a set of symptoms that we would nowadays call psychological or mental. In the words of Robert Burton, the great English writer, produced fear and sorrow. And yeah, it was a kind of an increasing awareness of this long and rich history of hypochondria, which made me realise that this was something much bigger than a short term paper for a master's course, and the research just kind of kept on happening after that term paper had been submitted and marked, and things went from there. And because I'm someone who's interested in literature, two other things started to happen. One of which is that I find myself, being drawn to writers who had themselves been hypochondriac, had been very preoccupied with their bodily health. But I also find myself reading medical texts as if they were themselves literature. And once I started doing that, I noticed that there's been this constant slippage in medical accounts of hypochondria, at least since the Victorian period, in which hypochondria names both a fear of illness but also a form of illness. And there's been these repeated attempts to make the two coincide, but it's as if no one has ever quite managed to do that entirely successfully, as if there's a kind of doubt in hypochondria that always exceeds the diagnostic concepts with which we try to contain it. So at what point do fear and concern and suspicion about disease themselves become a form of disease, become pathological, become hypochondria? Turns out that that's a really difficult question to answer. So in more ways than one, then, hypochondria seems to problematize the relationship between health and sickness. What interests me about this is that the hypochondriac's question, which is, am I sick or am I well, seems destined to repeat itself in our theories of hypochondria.
I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about the writers that you profile in here. You mentioned some of the characters who were self-identified or what we think of now as hypochondriacs. Did you know about these people beforehand, or did you sort of discover them in the research process? Were there any surprises?
With Kafka, for instance, it's difficult to read him at all without having the sense of someone who's highly attuned to the body, its health and its failures, its transformations. He's also someone who's really attuned to the paradoxes that emerge from not simply being, but also having a body. And what I mean by that is that in his fictional works, it's not simply the case that we're witness to bodily disfigurations. The commercial traveller who wakes up one morning to find that he's been transformed into an insect. Instead, what you have are these highly articulate subjects who are also bodily subjects who are constantly reflecting on what's happening to them. And through that process of reflection, questioning and doubting what's happening to them. Maybe they're exaggerating things or bringing it upon themselves or even making it all up. These are the kinds of questions that really torment Kafka's narrators. So in the Metamorphosis, when Gregor Samsa wakes up to find himself transformed into an insect, his first thought is that his boss is going to arrive and is going to accuse him of malingering. And his biggest concern is, how can I get to work? What was surprising with Kafka was just how often he uses the word hypochondriac to describe himself. In his letters, although interestingly never in his diaries, he's constantly referring to himself as a hypochondriac. Which is a really interesting thing, right? Because to say I'm a hypochondriac is almost akin to a kind of performative contradiction. It's a kind of confession that one doesn't entirely believe one's own beliefs. to say that I'm a hypochondriac means to say that I believe that I'm sick, but it also in a sense means to say that I don't believe my own belief that I'm sick, which seems like a very Kafka-esque predicament to be stuck in. There were other cases where I started reading writer precisely because I had a sense from the small secondary literature that's formed around hypochondria that they were people who could be described as hypochondriacs. So James Boswell is someone who falls into that second category. I knew from Susan Bower's book, Woeful Imaginings, and from Brian Dillon's wonderful book, Tormented Hope, that Boswell is also someone who's described himself as a hypochondriac. And in fact, in his late 30s, he wrote a series of periodical essays for a literary magazine under the pen name The Hypochondriac. And what Boswell means by hypochondria is something really different from what Kafka means by hypochondria and from what we mean by hypochondria when we speak about it today. It's something much more close, something which is much closer to a form of melancholy or depression, as well as an anxiety about what Boswell thought of as his idleness. And what's interesting in Boswell's case is just how productive his hypochondria is. He's so worried about being so distractible, and yet constantly assailed by distraction. He fills countless notebooks with these gossipy laments about just how distracted he is. And nowadays these notebooks keep many scholars in jobs. They're nowadays read as if they're literature.
I was wondering if there are any stories you had cut from this. Like, you include so much information about different writers, different stories, their own accounts of medical anxiety and hypochondria. Was there anything you had to cut from this that you wish you could have included?
Most things that I wanted to write about, I did end up writing about in some form. There had been a long section about a now obsolete diagnosis that was popular at the end of the 19th century called syphilophobia, or venereal hypochondriasis, which was the pathological fear of syphilis, which was quite a common diagnosis towards the end of the 19th century and was deemed to be responsible for a string of suicides and homicides. And it was a fascinating topic, but in the end, I just couldn't find space for it. And likewise with Samuel Beckett as well, who was very much a hypochondriac and towards the beginning of his career wrote many gossipy and unhappy letters about his minor bodily ailments, his pruritus and his boils. I again just couldn't find space for him, so he also ended up on the cutting room floor. And I think that with a book like Hypochondria, where the organising principle is association, part of the challenge is deciding which leads not to pursue, and that's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do a lot of the time, but ultimately you have to close down a few doors.
I have to follow up on the syphilis only because I was just listening to another podcast actually, which talked about a problem with syphilis when it was a major condition, was that symptoms could take years to manifest, and it only got really bad years and years later. So people could live in this paranoia about do I or do I not have syphilis, especially women who, have taken time away from their husbands or whatever. So it would have been a very paranoid time, knowing that, how rampant it could have been, with the idea you may not have symptoms manifest for years after contracting it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that at the fin de siècle, it was a kind of perfect storm because, I don't know what the statistics are across the board, but in London, something like 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 adult men had syphilis. And like you say, it could be latent for years, even decades, between becoming infected and the manifestation of the final and the kind of most devastating symptoms. But also, it was often referred to as the Great Imitator, which is a name that was given to syphilis by Sir Jonathan Hutchinson. And that's because it could manifest in such a diverse array of ways. It could affect virtually any organ in the body. And more or less any symptom could be a symptom of syphilis. So what that meant then was that anyone who has, a not entirely chaste past could worry about having syphilis with the emergence of virtually any symptom.
Will Rees, thank you very much for appearing on the Coach House podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, James.
Thank you. And that's our show. Thanks, as always, to all the writers, both Stuart and Will, who are on the show, and all the writers who are busy toiling away in solitude, silence, working to change the world with words. I'm James Lindsay. The show is produced by Andrew Kaufman. This is our 60th anniversary. Thanks for listening. See you next time.